Hey everyone! Today we're diving into the story of one of the most interesting and powerful figures from the Hebrew Bible, Amos, the prophet. Now, you've probably heard of famous prophets like Isaiah or Jeremiah, but Amos is actually one of the earliest prophets to put his visions into writing. So let's talk about his life, his message, and why his teachings still hold such a powerful place today. Alright, to start, Amos lived around 760 to 755 BCE, and the story kicks off during a time when Israel was actually split into two separate kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. It all goes back to the reign of King David and his son Solomon, who united the 12 tribes of Israel under one banner. But after Solomon's death, things went south, literally. The kingdom split into two. 10 tribes in the north, under a leader named Jeroboam, broke away to form Israel, and the two remaining tribes, Judah and Benjamin, stuck it out in the south, forming the kingdom of Judah. Now, Solomon, while famous for his wisdom, made a few mistakes during his reign. To build the first stone temple in Jerusalem, he forced labor on the tribes of Israel, much like Pharaoh did back in Egypt. And to make things worse, he allowed idolatry to creep in, letting his many wives worship their own gods and build shrines all over the place. After his death, the northern tribes had had enough of this forced labor and asked his son to stop it, but he flat out refused. That led to the split, and for centuries after, these two kingdoms were on and off at war with each other. Amos himself was from the southern kingdom of Judah, but he felt called to deliver his message up north in the kingdom of Israel, particularly in the cities of Samaria and Bethel. And here's where things get really interesting. The northern kingdom had set up their own temple in Bethel, but it wasn't exactly kosher. They mixed in idol worship, with a golden calf no less, which of course wasn't sitting well with Amos or, more importantly, with God. Amos's message was loud and clear. You can't mix idolatry with the worship of the one true God. And when Amos started calling out these sins, the high priest Amaziah wasn't having any of it. He reported Amos to the king, and Amos had to flee back to Judah. But before leaving, he decided to write down his visions so others could read and reflect on them. Now, during this period, the mighty Assyrian Empire was on the rise, and in 722 BCE, they marched into the northern kingdom of Israel, conquered it, and scattered the 10 tribes across the land. These tribes essentially disappeared from history. Amos had warned of this destruction, and sadly, his warnings came true. But Amos's message wasn't just about political downfall, it was deeply rooted in social justice. He believed the Israelites were being punished not only because of idolatry, but also because of how they treated each other, especially the divide between the rich and the poor. Amos wasn't afraid to call out the elites in Israel, accusing them of neglecting the poor, cheating in business, and living in luxury while others suffered. Amos wasn't just talking about minor issues, he was painting a picture of society crumbling from the inside due to greed, corruption, and inequality. And he spoke with such conviction because he believed that God, as a God of justice, cared more about how people lived their lives than the rituals and offerings they performed. In one of his most famous passages, Amos declared that God despised empty religious rituals and wanted justice to roll on like a river and righteousness like a never-failing stream. It's important to note that Amos didn't reject Israel's rituals outright, but he made it crystal clear that without moral behavior, without justice and righteousness, all those burnt offerings and sacrifices meant nothing. He believed that the covenant between God and Israel was like a moral contract. If the people didn't live up to their end of the deal, then God was fully within his rights to dissolve that contract and allow the consequences to unfold. Amos's warnings weren't just directed at Israel's enemies or the neighboring nations. He pointed the finger squarely at Israel and even Judah for straying from God's laws and turning towards false gods. He warned that if they didn't turn back, destruction was coming. So, Amos's story is really one about accountability, both on a personal and a national level. He wasn't afraid to stand up and speak out, even when it put him at odds with powerful figures like the king or the high priest. And his message? It's still relevant today. He reminds us that what truly matters isn't just saying the right words or performing rituals, but living a life of justice, treating others fairly, and staying true to what's right. And Amos may have lived centuries before the time of Jesus, but his teachings and visions didn't stay stuck in the past. When Christianity began to spread, one big question came up. What about the Gentiles, or non-Jews? Could they be a part of this new faith without following Jewish customs like circumcision, dietary laws, or keeping the Sabbath? Well, this all came to a head in what's known as the Apostolic Council in Jerusalem. This was a huge moment in early Christianity. James, one of the key leaders, made a pretty bold decision. Gentiles could join the faith without having to adopt those traditional Jewish practices. And how did he back this up? He quoted none other than Amos. Specifically from Amos 9, where the prophet speaks about God restoring the fallen house of David and bringing in not just Israel, but all nations. That line, "I will restore David's fallen shelter, and will rebuild it as it used to be," was interpreted by James as a sign that the time had come for all people, Jew and Gentile alike, to come together under God's name. Amos's vision was being used to explain this new chapter in faith history. But here's where it gets a bit tricky. While early Christians found inspiration in Amos's prophecies, they also used some of his harsh criticisms of Israel in a more negative way. Some Christian writers started to apply Amos's condemnations of the Israelites to Judaism as a whole. They saw Amos's warnings as proof that the Jewish people had strayed from God, and unfortunately, this became a part of some of the early Christian polemic against Jews. It's a complex and often painful part of the history between Christianity and Judaism, but it shows just how powerful and lasting Amos's words were, even when they were interpreted in different ways. Fast forward to more recent history, and Amos's message still resonates, especially when it comes to social justice. You might be surprised to know that one of the most famous speeches in modern history, Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, quoted Amos directly. King said, "We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." This was Amos's exact sentiment. Justice and righteousness are not just ideals to hope for, but forces that should flow through society like a never-ending stream. Amos's call for fairness between rich and poor, his push for a just society, continues to inspire movements for justice today. There's also a fascinating apocryphal story about Amos's death. The Lives of the Prophets, an ancient collection of stories, claims that Amos was actually killed by the son of Amaziah, that same high priest from Bethel who had Amos exiled. The story goes that after Amos's bold preaching, this son couldn't take it anymore and struck him down. According to the tradition, Amos was later buried in Judah, his homeland. And here's something cool. Amos wasn't just an influential prophet in his lifetime or in the centuries that followed. Both the Eastern Orthodox and Western Christian traditions have elevated him as a saint. His legacy, both spiritual and social, lives on in ways that continue to affect how people view justice, morality, and faith.